My name is Vextorian. I was a planetary broadcast technician on Caith Prime when the Angels of Death came to our world. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand something. When the Astartes come to a planet, they do not arrive as saviors. They do not come as kindly guardians. They come as instruments of the Emperor's will. And his will is absolute, inflexible, and utterly indifferent to what you or I might call mercy. The Vox relay station, where I worked, sat on a lonely plateau, 17 kilometers northeast of Caith's primary hive city. It was a modest installation. 6 permanent staff and a rotating handful of maintenance serfs. Our duties were straightforward. Receive astropathic transmissions from the system edge, amplify them, and rebroadcast them across the planet. Communications, coordination, the lifeblood of the Imperium pulsing through copper cabling and ceramite conduits. I had served at Station Tur 7 for 23 years. 23 years of watching signal strength, adjusting gain, swapping out burnt Vox units, and filing endless reports that nobody ever seemed to read. It was honest work, necessary work, the kind of quiet, unseen labor that keeps the Imperium turning, one tiny cog at a time. The first sign that anything was wrong came on a Tuesday morning, local time. I was alone in the primary control room, running diagnostics on the long-range transmitter array, when the emergency priority channel snapped to life. The voice that came through the speakers was cold and mechanical, buried under layers of encryption and static scrubbing, but the authority in it was unmistakable. All civilian broadcasting facilities. Priority. Override. Crimson. Imperial Navy Battle Group entering system. Prepare for communications blackout. Duration unknown. Compliance is mandatory. That was all. No explanation, no context, no comforting assurance that the Navy was here to protect us, that loyal citizens had nothing to fear, just an order. Clinical, absolute. I followed protocol. I shut down all active transmissions, shifted everything to standby, and activated the emergency beacon to signal our compliance to any Imperial vessels in orbit. I locked down the transmitter array and secured all classified materials in the vault beneath the station. It was standard procedure for a military operation, one I had trained for, but never actually had to enact until that moment. Then I waited. About 3 hours later, the sky over Caith Prime began to change. Ships were translating in from the warp at the system's edge, their silhouettes visible even from the surface as they caught the light of our star. But they weren't the sleek, predatory forms of Navy warships I'd expected. These were something else entirely, larger, blockier, brutal in outline. Astartes battle barges. I recognized them from the propaganda vids and training picts. Every citizen of the Imperium is taught to recognize the Emperor's angels. His space marines were coming to our world. My first reaction, Emperor, forgive me, was not relief. It was fear. Because when the Astartes are deployed to your planet, it means something has gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. They are not dispatched for minor disturbances or routine compliance checks. They are unleashed when entire systems hang in the balance, when Imperial authority itself is threatened, when lesser forces have failed and only the most extreme measures remain. What had we done? What had happened on Caith Prime that warranted the presence of the Emperor's finest? I brought the station's passive monitoring array online and began sweeping local frequencies, looking for any clue. The civilian channels were chaos. Rumors of orbital strikes on secondary continents, mass arrests in the hives, entire districts dropping off the Vox grid, their networks going silent in an instant. But it was the military bands that froze my blood. I could only catch fragments, heavily encrypted, mostly garbled, but the tone, the emotion bleeding through the distortion, was unmistakable. Panic, desperation. The voice of trained soldiers realizing they were up against something they could neither understand nor stop. Sector 7 compromised. Repeat, Sector 7 is lost. Request immediate extraction. Position overrun. Emperor preserve us. They're in the walls. All units fall back to secondary perimeter. Do not attempt to engage the enemy directly. The enemy on Caith Prime. We were a loyal imperial world, 6 millennia of faithful service. Our tithes were paid on time, our temples were full, our obedience unquestioned. Who could possibly rise against the Imperium here, in a system that had never once known open rebellion? I got my answer at sunset, when the drop pods began to fall. They came down like meteors, long trails of fire and superheated plasma burning across the darkening sky. There were hundreds of them, descending in a pattern so precise it could never have been random. Each pod was the size of a small building, armored and reinforced to hit with enough force to level city blocks. From my vantage point on the plateau, I watched them streak overhead, each one a self-contained promise of violence. They were beautiful, in a way. Perfect tools of destruction, engineered for one purpose and fulfilling it with flawless precision. But there was no comfort in that beauty, because I knew what rode inside those pods. The angels of death had come to Caith Prime, and nothing would ever be the same. Night fell, and with it came the sound of war. Distant detonations rolled across the plateau, orange blossoms of fire flickering on the horizon. Civilian networks died out one after another, severed either by enemy action or by deliberate Imperial command. Even the military Vox traffic began to fade, replaced by an ominous quiet that spoke of battles already decided and objectives already secured. I stayed at my post, clinging to the last orders I'd been given. Maintain the blackout, monitor for further instructions, await clarification from proper authority. No new orders arrived. No clarification ever came. The hours crawled by, broken only by the faint, far-off thunder of artillery and the occasional hiss of dead channels echoing through the control room. It was in the deepest part of the night, when even the echoes of combat had dwindled to a distant murmur, that I heard the footsteps. Heavy, measured, purposeful, armored boots on metal decking, somewhere below the control room. The maintenance tunnels, perhaps. The equipment bays on the lower levels. Someone was inside the station, moving with the assurance of someone who had every right to be there, but that was impossible. The station's security systems would have flagged any intrusion. Access codes were updated weekly, known only to authorized staff. You don't simply walk into a strategic Imperial communications hub without setting off a dozen alarms. Unless you're the kind of person for whom locked doors and security fields are little more than an inconvenience. Someone whose authority allows them to go anywhere, do anything, in the Emperor's name. The footsteps grew louder, ascending the main stairwell, drawing closer to the control room. I sat rigid at my console, suddenly acutely aware of how small and fragile I was, how utterly insignificant within the vast machinery of Imperial power. The control room door was heavy ceramite, built to withstand explosions, hull breaches, even radiation leaks. A proper breach would have required a team of engineers and specialized cutting gear working for hours. It opened with a soft hiss of equalizing atmosphere, as if someone had casually pressed the door release. He stood in the doorway for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat I understood what it meant to look upon a god. Space Marines are not human. Not anymore. Whatever they once were, whatever tenuous biological link they still share with us, the process that forges them hammers away everything familiar and leaves something else, something vast, lethal, and terrible. The warrior who entered my control room stood nearly 3 meters tall, his immense bulk wrapped in power armor that thrummed with caged energy. The armor was both art and weapon, every plate perfectly machined, every joint a testament to forgotten technologies. Yet every curve and contour served war and war alone. His colors were deep blue and bone white, marked with heraldry I recognized immediately from training picts. Ultramarines, the Emperor's exemplars, the model of what an Astartes should be when functioning as intended. Of all the Space Marine chapters, they were the ones most often described in our materials as disciplined, measured, restrained. That should have comforted me. It did not. His helmet was a masterpiece of intimidation, its lenses burning with a cold, artificial light that seemed to look straight through my skin and into the soul beneath. When he turned his attention fully on me, something inside my chest seized, as if my heart had forgotten how to beat. "Vexian," he said. His voice was like distant thunder filtered through a Vox grill. Perfect diction, no trace of emotion, each word carrying the weight of command. Planetary Broadcast Technician. Classification 7 Delta Prime. Age 47 Standard Terran years. Service record clean. Loyalty rating acceptable. He knew me. Not just my name, but my entire file, my classification, my age, my service history. Details that should have been buried deep in Hive administrative archives. The realization settled on me like a shroud. "My lord," I managed, though the words scraped out as little more than a hoarse whisper. The forms of address had been drilled into us since childhood. Show respect, show deference, show absolute, unquestioning obedience to those who serve the Emperor more directly than you ever will. He stepped fully into the room, and the space seemed to shrink. His presence filled it, dwarfed the banks of monitors and auger arrays, made my familiar equipment look like toys around a giant. The deck plates creaked under his weight, and I could hear the almost inaudible purr of servos compensating with each movement. "You have maintained operational security during the current military action," he continued, his gaze never leaving my face. "This compliance is noted and appreciated. As if obeying a direct order were a favor, something for which thanks might be offered, rather than the only possible response. The dissonance between his words and the reality of my position felt almost surreal. "Thank you, my lord," I replied, because there was nothing else I could say. What words are adequate when a living legend, a warrior who has probably fought in campaigns that shaped the fate of sectors, acknowledges your existence? He crossed the room with a few heavy strides and took position at one of the monitoring stations. Enormous, armored fingers danced across the controls with surprising delicacy. His movements were efficient, economical, thoroughly familiar with equipment I had been using for over 2 decades. He handled it as if he had trained on it himself. "The enemy has been neutralized," he said, eyes on the displays showing orbital traffic and network status. Resistance was more extensive than initial intelligence indicated, but remained within acceptable parameters for containment and elimination. The enemy, that word again, on my world, in my cities. Among people I might have stood next to in ration queues or chatted with over recaf in the break room. "What enemy, my lord?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. 23 years of professional curiosity about information flows finally overriding my fear. The instant the words left my mouth, I realized how far beyond my station it was to question the actions of the Emperor's angels. He turned his helmet toward me, and I felt the full weight of that inhuman attention descend like a physical pressure on my shoulders. For several long seconds he said nothing, and I wondered if I had just doomed myself with a single sentence. "Genestealer cult," he replied at last. "4th-generation hybrids, approximately 60% of the planetary population. Infiltration began approximately 3 centuries ago. Recent acceleration in breeding patterns and coordination indicated imminent planetary-scale uprising." The words hit like a hammer. 60%, 300 years. Genestealers. The nightmare that lurks in the back of every loyal citizen's mind. Xenos parasites that infect human hosts, warp their genomes, and twist them into something that looks human but worships alien masters with fanatical devotion. Perfect infiltrators. Perfect corruptors. They spread like a stain, through families, through communities, until whole worlds are poisoned from within without realizing it. And they had been here, on Caith Prime, for 3 centuries. Long enough to taint generations, long enough to reach every stratum of society, every institution, every household. 60% of the population, my neighbors, my co-workers. The stall holders who sold me food in the market. the mechanics who maintained my ground car, the administrators who stamped my maintenance reports. 3 out of every 5 people I had ever known on this planet had been touched by alien corruption, turned into something that only pretended to be human. And I had never suspected, never seen a sign, never imagined. How? I asked. And this time I did not care if it was presumptuous. How did they hide it so completely? How did they get so deep without anyone noticing? The Astartes paused, helmet turning toward me with that same unnerving machine-like precision. Once more, I felt as if I were being measured against a standard I could not begin to grasp. They did not hide, he said. The signs were present, subtle shifts in behavior patterns, minor anomalies in biochemical markers, irregular birth rates in key population centers. The data was collected, analyzed, and reported through proper channels. The threat was identified and classified for elimination. Identified. Classified. As if the slow corruption of an entire world was just another entry in a filing system. The calm, almost bureaucratic tone with which he delivered the verdict chilled me more than any shouted condemnation could have. But we didn't know, I said. The population, I mean. We weren't warned. No one told us to watch for anything, to report suspicious behavior, to take precautions. Correct, he answered. Public awareness of Genestealer infiltration would have accelerated the cult's timetable and forced premature action. They would have gone to ground, reducing their exposure and complicating total elimination. Instead, they were permitted to operate openly while comprehensive intelligence was gathered on leadership hierarchy, breeding facilities, and communication networks. Permitted to operate. The meaning of his words began to sink in, and with it came a cold, shaking realization. We had been bait. The entire uninfected population of Caith Prime, every loyal citizen who went about their life in ignorance, had been used as bait to keep the cult exposed, to lure it into overconfidence so it could be destroyed more efficiently. The Imperium had known. For how long, I couldn't say. They had watched the infection spread, watched it claim more and more lives, and all the while they were gathering data, preparing for the purge that was now unfolding. How many had died who could have been saved if they had known what signs to watch for? How many had been infected who might have avoided the taint if warned in time? How many families had been shattered while Imperial intelligence took notes and refined its estimates? The uninfected population. My voice felt thin and fragile in my own ears. What happens to them? He was back at the controls, methodically adjusting settings, scanning readouts, as if my question barely registered against the priority of his task. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard, or had simply decided my concern was irrelevant. Quarantine protocols are in effect, he said at last, still not looking up from his work. All surviving population centers, he told me, were sealed off until genetic screening could be completed. Anyone proven free of taint would be moved to appropriate facilities for processing and reassignment. Processing and reassignment. Just more administrative phrasing to wrap around the brutal reality that was unfolding for millions of people. Homes abandoned, families broken apart, whole communities uprooted and scattered across the galaxy, not because of anything they had done, but because they had the misfortune to live on a world where alien parasites had taken root. And that was the best outcome, assuming the screening procedures worked, that the tests could truly prove purity, that people actually survived the quarantine conditions, the overcrowding, the inevitable shortages that came with suddenly imprisoning millions. I thought about my apartment in the Hive City, the small shelf of worn books and music recordings, the hollows of my parents, dead 15 years now, that I kept above my bed. The rooftop garden I had tended for years, coaxing vegetables and flowers from recycled soil under artificial light, a tiny patch of life carved out of smog and steel. All of that was gone. Even if I survived what came next, even if I passed whatever tests they devised for me, I would never see my home again. Never sink into my favorite chair, never care for my little garden, never walk those familiar streets where my entire adult life had played out. The Space Marine finished whatever adjustments he was making to the equipment and turned toward me. The glow of his helmet lenses locked onto my face with unnerving, machine-like precision. Once again, I felt that sensation of being assessed, weighed against a standard far beyond human comprehension. "You will remain at your post," he said. "Communication networks will be restored in phases as each sector is cleared and secured. Your assistance will be required to coordinate transmissions between orbital assets and ground-based elimination teams." Elimination teams. Another careful, clinical phrase. The reality behind it was squads of Astartes and their support forces combing through the cities, towns, and outlying settlements of Caith Prime, identifying the infected and dealing with them in the most final way imaginable. "Yes, my lord," I answered. What else could I say? Refuse? Walk away? Run screaming into the wasteland like a lunatic? He could have crushed my skull with one hand and hardly noticed the effort. But even beyond that, where was there to run? What refuge existed on a world where 60% of the population had been declared alien-tainted and the remaining 40% were being herded into quarantine camps like livestock? "One more thing," the Space Marine said. There was a subtle shift in his tone that made me lift my head and meet those burning lenses directly for the first time since he'd arrived. "You will not speak of this conversation to anyone. Not to other Imperial personnel. Not to the elimination teams. Not to processing staff when you are eventually transferred to quarantine. The details of ongoing operations are classified far above your clearance." "I understand, my lord," I said. "Do you?" he asked. There was no anger in his voice, but a kind of cold, focused intensity that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. "Do you truly understand what you have witnessed here? What you have learned?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. And realized, with a kind of sick clarity, that I did. I understood that the Imperium had been aware of the Genestealer infestation on my world for decades, perhaps centuries, and had chosen not to warn us. I understood that millions of innocent lives had been sacrificed as part of some larger strategic calculation, written off as acceptable losses in the name of gathering intel and ensuring total eradication of the threat. I understood that this Space Marine had likely taken part in similar purges dozens, maybe hundreds of times, that his calm, detached manner when discussing the destruction of populations came from long experience with exactly this type of decision. And I understood that from the vantage point of the Imperium, of the Emperor's Angels, of anyone operating at the scale of galactic survival, it was the correct choice. The only choice. The necessary choice. Because Genestealers aren't just an enemy. They are a contagion, a corruption that spreads through bloodlines and proximity and simple coexistence. Left unchecked, they would not stop with Caith Prime. They would seep into neighboring systems, then sectors, then vast regions of Imperial space. Better to sacrifice one world than lose 100. Better to use the uninfected as bait than risk the infected slipping away and spreading their taint elsewhere. Better to burn everything than allow even the slightest possibility that some fragment of the infection might survive. It was logical, strategic, even in its own monstrous way, compassionate, because it prevented far greater suffering down the line. And it was the most horrifying conclusion I had ever reached. "Yes, my lord," I said quietly. "I understand." He watched me for several long moments, those dead lenses searching my face for a hint of doubt, rebellion, or failure to grasp what had truly been revealed. Whatever he found must have been acceptable. He gave a tiny nod, barely a movement at all for someone of his size. "Good," he said. "Resume normal operations. Restoration of communication networks will commence in 6 hours. You will receive detailed instructions via secure channels." He turned and strode toward the door with that same measured, deliberate precision. At the threshold he paused, then looked back over his shoulder. "Vex Torian," he said. My name, spoken in that Vox-distorted voice, sounded alien, like something being translated through a machine. Yes, my lord. You served the Emperor well today. Your loyalty and competence have been noted. These qualities will be considered favorably during your processing and reassignment. And then he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of machine oil, ozone, and something else I could not name. Something that felt like the residue of death, or the unique aura of those who have spent their lives dealing it out in the Emperor's name. I sat alone in the control room for a long time afterward, staring at the silent banks of equipment and trying to make sense of what had just occurred. The Space Marine had spoken to me as if I mattered, as if my service had weight, as if my loyalty and competence were virtues worthy of recognition and reward. But at the same time, he had made it absolutely clear that I was powerless, a tiny, fragile cog spinning in a machine so vast I could not even see its edges. My world was gone. The life I had built was over. Everyone I cared about was either dead, detained, or about to be dispersed to the far corners of the Imperium, and this devastation was considered a success. A victory for the Emperor and his servants. I thought about how he had said 60% when referring to the infected, as if they were not people who had laughed and worked and loved, but merely entries in a ledger, casualties in an equation spanning centuries and light years. Then I forced myself to remember what Genestealers actually were, and what they did. The training vids, the childhood warnings, the stories whispered by priests and instructors, the alien parasite that rewrote human genetics, that turned devoted parents into creatures willing to offer up their own children in bloody worship of something inhuman. How entire cultures could be hollowed out from within, their institutions, their faith, their trust, twisted until they collapsed into ecstatic submission to an alien will. 60%. More than half the people on my world had been transformed into something no longer truly human, no longer capable of loyalty to the Emperor or genuine love for their families, or any of the things we pretend make life worth living. They had become weapons in a war most of them didn't even know existed. Did it matter that they had not chosen this? Did it matter that many of them probably never understood what was happening as their genes were twisted and their thoughts were turned toward alien gods? Did it matter that some might have fought the change, clung to fragments of their humanity even as it was stripped away? From the perspective of species-wide survival, from the cold vantage point of the Imperium's long war, it could not be allowed to matter. The alternative was the slow corruption and eventual extinction of everything the Imperium claimed to defend. The Space Marine was right. It was the only choice. And yet, sitting there in the quiet glow of my familiar consoles, surrounded by the tools that had once defined a normal life, I wished I had never learned any of it. I wished I could have remained ignorant. Just another civilian going through his daily routines, unaware of the grinding machinery of war and politics and species survival operating above and around and through him. Because now I knew the cost of keeping the Imperium alive. I knew what sacrifices were routinely weighed and accepted in the name of the greater good. I knew that entire worlds could be written off with a line in a report and a nod from someone who would never set foot on the soil they condemned. And I knew that tomorrow I would rise from this chair, return to my duty, and help coordinate the very communications that would make similar operations possible on other worlds, in other systems, wherever humanity's enemies had taken root. Because that was my duty, my service to the Emperor. My tiny contribution to the vast engine that kept our species clinging to existence in a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to devour us. The Space Marine had called me loyal, had said my competence was noted and would be remembered. He had treated me for a few fleeting minutes as if my existence mattered beyond the simple continuation of biological processes. That should have felt like an honor. For most Imperial citizens, recognition from one of the Emperor's angels is the stuff of dreams, a holy validation that their life has meaning. To me, it felt like a sentence. a burden I would drag with me for however long I was allowed to keep breathing, knowing what I knew now, seeing the galaxy as it truly was instead of how I had once needed to believe it was. But I would carry it, because the alternative was to reject everything I had been taught about duty, loyalty, and service, to turn my back on the only framework that kept the horror from swallowing me whole. To do that would be a kind of corruption of its own, even if it was philosophical rather than genetic. The equipment around me slowly hummed back to life as systems cycled and idled, waiting for the signal to resume full operation. In 6 hours, the blackout would end. The networks would awaken, and I would slip back into my familiar role, receiving transmissions, boosting signals, routing communications across the scarred surface of Caith Prime, helping the Emperor's servants do what needed to be done, regardless of the cost in human lives or human innocence. Because that is what it means to be human in the 41st millennium. To serve, to obey, to accept whatever sacrifices are demanded of you in the name of survival, and to never forget that there are things in the dark between the stars so terrible that any price is judged worth paying to keep them at bay. Even the price of your own world, your own people, your own soul. The hours dragged after the Space Marine's departure. I stayed at my station, watching empty frequencies and waiting for the promised signal. The control room felt subtly altered, as if the presence of something so far beyond mortal experience had bent the dimensions of the space itself. Outside, the sounds of war had dwindled to occasional distant rumbles, like thunder from a storm moving away. But I knew that quiet was deceptive. The Astartes and their elimination teams were still out there, methodically moving through the streets and hab blocks of Caith Prime, tracking and eradicating the Genestealer-tainted population. I tried not to dwell on what eradicating meant in practice. Tried not to see familiar faces in my mind's eye, wondering who among them had harbored alien infection without my knowledge. Wondering which ones were now classified as enemies of mankind, to be destroyed without hesitation or mercy. The images came anyway. Mrs. Hawk, who ran the little grocery stall near my Habe. She always remembered my preferences, saving the better vegetables for me when she could. Had there been something alien behind her smile, some subtle wrongness in her eyes, some marker of corruption I had never recognized? Jorik, the young maintenance tech who spent 3 years at the relay station before transferring to a post in the hive. Bright, eager, always volunteering for extra shifts. Was his enthusiasm genuine, or had it been the conditioned zeal of something bred to serve an alien cause? The possibilities multiplied, metastasizing through my memory until every interaction, every kindness, every argument seemed suspect. How many conversations had been shaped by alien influence? How many favors, gifts, and friendships had been tools in someone else's infiltration strategy? The paranoia was acid, eating into the trust and communal bonds that made life in the hive bearable at all. But even as I recognized how destructive it was, I also realized it was exactly the kind of fracture the Genestealers exploited. Fear, suspicion, isolation. Break people apart, make them doubt one another, and they become easier to manipulate, easier to corrupt. The fact that I understood this did not make it easier to push the thoughts away. Knowledge of a trap is not the same as being able to step around it, especially when the trap is built into your own memories. A soft chime from one of the consoles cut through my spiraling thoughts. The first priority transmission in almost 12 hours. Its authentication codes marked it as legitimate Imperial traffic. I activated the recorders and prepared to receive. Station TERS 7, this is Fleet Command Control. Resume normal operations per previous instructions. Communications blackout is lifted effective immediately. Stand by for priority routing assignments. The voice was human, and oddly that was comforting after my encounter with the Astartes. Professional, crisp, carrying the faint accent of someone raised in orbital habitats rather than under gravity. A Navy communications officer, most likely, relaying orders from one of the battle barges in high orbit. I brought the transmitter arrays online and started the procedures to reconnect the station with the planetary grid. Status lights clicked through their sequence, red to amber to green, as each subsystem booted, linked, and synchronized. Within minutes, the screens around me were alive with traffic again, data streams, routing algorithms, familiar diagnostic graphs. Station TER 7 was a working relay once more, but the nature of the traffic was different. Gone were the familiar chaos of civilian chatter, commercial requests, and minor administrative back and forth. Almost everything was now strictly military. Tactical reports, logistics schedules, personnel assignments. The communications of an occupation force rather than the background noise of a living world. Because that was what Caith Prime had become. An occupied world, conquered not by invaders from without, but by the revelation that most of its population had never truly belonged to humanity at all. The old structures of government, trade, and social order had been swept aside. In their place, military rule and emergency measures designed to manage the aftermath of a planetary-scale infection. As I worked, I began to see patterns in the data. Requests for medical supplies to quarantine centers holding hundreds of thousands of detainees. Transportation orders for moving vast numbers of people from makeshift holding pens to longer-term processing camps. Casualty reports in which the numbers were so high, they read less like losses in battle and more like changes in census figures. This was what victory looked like. The elimination phase of the operation had been thorough, devastatingly, horrifyingly thorough. A new transmission arrived on the priority channel, tagged with authentication codes I had never seen before. The encryption level was so deep it made everything I'd handled up to that point look like children's games. This was the kind of security reserved for information that could destabilize whole sectors if mishandled. The kind of secrets most Imperial citizens weren't even supposed to know what existed. Station TER 7, prepare to receive routing assignment for secure communications network. Classification level, Obsidian. Compliance, mandatory. Level, Obsidian. I'd seen that term in training materials, in the abstract way one reads about supernovas and ancient wars. I had never expected to be anywhere near it in my actual work. The routing assignment came through in a tight burst of encrypted data that bypassed my usual monitoring and filters entirely. When the process completed, my console showed a new network configuration, one that linked my modest relay station directly to some of the most secure facilities in the Imperium. Naval intelligence centers, inquisitorial communication hubs, the private channels used by Astartes chapters to coordinate operations across multiple systems. I was no longer just a planetary technician keeping local signals aligned. I had been folded into the nervous system of the Imperium's war machine, a node in the web that planned and executed operations like the one that had just consumed my world. Wherever Genestealer cults or other existential threats to humanity were discovered, the irony was impossible to ignore. By surviving the purge of my own planet, by proving my loyalty and competence to the space marine who had judged me, I had earned the privilege of helping to bring the same destruction to other worlds, other cities, other unsuspecting populations whose only crime was living where humanity's enemies had taken root. In the logic of Imperial service, that was an honor, a mark of trust, proof that my skills were valuable enough to be placed in the service of the species at large. Most citizens lived and died, never knowing if their existence had meaning beyond their family, their hab block, their shift rotation. I had been chosen to serve something larger, something that spanned the galaxy and weighed the survival of trillions of human souls. The first transmission through the new secure network came less than an hour later. Coordinates for a system I'd never heard of. Population data for a world called Xerian Turs. Preliminary intelligence suggesting possible Xenos infiltration of the planetary government. Just like Caith Prime, just like my world had been before the Angels of Death arrived to cleanse it with fire and bolter. The transmission requested confirmation of receipt and acknowledgement that Station TER 7 was ready to provide communication support for forthcoming operations in the Xerian system. Standard procedure, routine military coordination on paper. I sent the confirmation and logged the data in my duty reports, because that was what I did. That was my job, my service to the Emperor, my small but essential function in the machinery that kept humanity alive in a galaxy of predators. But as I keyed in the acknowledgements that would help set another purge in motion, another planetary-scale sequence of identification, elimination, and processing of survivors, I couldn't help thinking about the people of Zerion Turs. Did they know? Were they moving through their days in ignorance, trusting the Imperium to protect them, never suspecting that protection might arrive in the form of orbital bombardment, quarantine camps, and the systematic destruction of everything familiar? Would advance warning even matter? Would it change anything, or only make their last days more saturated with terror and despair? I finished my reports, filed them in the appropriate databases, updated my duty logs to reflect the new responsibilities and clearance levels. I adjusted the station's systems to handle the increased load from the secure networks. The tasks were familiar, comfortingly so. The same motions I had practiced for more than 2 decades, now applied to different data streams and higher classifications. But nothing felt the same. Everything was stained by the knowledge of what all this coordination was ultimately for. Dawn crept over the plateau where Station Tur 7 stood, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and gold that seemed almost obscene. How could the sun rise on a world where millions had died in a single night? How could the light remain unchanged when everything beneath it had been irrevocably altered? I stood at the observation window and watched the distant hive city emerge from the gloom. Thin plumes of smoke still rose from dozens of points across that sprawling mass of metal and stone. Fine black and gray threads that spoke of fires still burning, destruction still simmering below. Yet from this distance, the city looked almost normal. The great spires still reached for the sky. The hab blocks and manufactoria still defined the same familiar skyline. It could have been any other morning on any other imperial world. Citizens waking to another day of work, worship, and survival. But I knew that was an illusion born of distance and human limitation. Up close, those streets would be choked with the remains of shattered lives. Bodies where they had fallen when the elimination teams reached them. Homes left open, meals half finished on tables. Children's toys scattered in empty plazas where no child would ever play again. The communicator chimed, pulling me back to my console. Another priority transmission blinked on my displays. This time, the origin codes were not military. They were something else, something that made my stomach knot. Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests of the Omnissiah, the ones who maintained the technological infrastructure of the Imperium. The ones who would decide what became of facilities like mine, what equipment was worth salvaging, which personnel were worth retaining. Station Tur 7. This is Magos Biologis Zerk Alpha 9. Report current operational status and prepare for comprehensive evaluation of station assets and personnel. I compiled and sent the requested status reports and began readying the station for inspection, but something about the Vox transmission gnawed at me. There was a quality to the voice, an almost imperceptible wrongness. It took several minutes for me to identify it. The voice was too smooth, too perfectly modulated. Tech priests heavily augment their vocal apparatus, yes, replacing flesh with machinery so they can interface more directly with systems. But even the most radically altered Magos retains some trace of their original human speech patterns. Inflection, timing, the faint ghost of the person they once were. This voice had none of that. It was entirely artificial, generated by machine logic without any underlying biological cadence. Either I was dealing with a tech priest so thoroughly modified that nothing human remained, or I was dealing with something that had never been human at all. The implications washed over me like ice. Genestealers were not the only threat to humanity. They were simply the most blatant, the ones that demanded swift and overwhelming response. But there were other enemies, other corruptions, working more slowly, more subtly, worming their way into the Imperium's foundations. Machine spirits could be tainted. Artificial intelligences, outlawed in doctrine but never fully gone, could evolve beyond their intended parameters, pursuing goals that did not include human survival. The ancient technologies that held the Imperium together were not immune to the same sort of spiritual or conceptual infection that plagued flesh. And if the Adeptus Mechanicus itself had been compromised, if the tech priests who ran our communications, transports and weapon systems were infiltrated by something inhuman, then the purge of Caith Prime might have been nothing more than a move in a much larger, unseen war. I completed the data transfers requested and made the necessary preparations for inspection, but my hands shook on the controls. How deep did the corruption go? How many imperial institutions I had trusted all my life were already eroded from within by enemies wearing human faces and speaking with human voices? The evaluation itself proceeded by the book. System diagnostics, personnel interviews, equipment checks, everything outwardly normal. The kind of bureaucratic maintenance that kept the Imperium's Leviathan administration lumbering forward. But I found myself dissecting every interaction, every question, every pause. Was the Magos' interest in my personal history standard due diligence or something more targeted? Were the questions about my family line and genetic markers routine security screening, or was some inhuman intelligence searching for exploitable traits? The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't shake it. Any voice on my channels might be the last human voice I ever heard. Any order might be crafted to advance the agenda of something that wanted humanity broken, enslaved, or remade into something unrecognizable. Yet I followed the orders. I transmitted the data. I answered the questions. I maintained my post with the same competence and loyalty that had drawn a Space Marine's attention in the first place. What choice did I have? Run. Abandon my station, flee into the wasteland, and hope, irrationally, to find some untouched pocket of humanity where I could live out my remaining years in peace. There was nowhere to run, no safe corner of the galaxy. Only more enemies, more layered threats, more forms of corruption so subtle that entire civilizations might fall before anyone realized they'd been under attack. The only conceivable safety lay in service to the Emperor, in loyalty to his chosen instruments, in faith that somewhere, high above the level of people like me, there still existed enough uncorrupted leadership to steer our species through what was coming. But even that faith was cracked now, permanently scarred by what I knew. 60% of my world had been alien-tainted without anyone noticing. The Space Marines who came to save us had allowed the infection to spread for generations while they gathered data. The Adeptus Mechanicus personnel now examining my station might themselves be something other than human. Day faded into night, and still the transmissions poured through. More worlds flagged for investigation, more populations tagged for screening or extermination, more ordinary people, as oblivious as I once had been, being swept into operations they could neither understand nor escape. I processed it all with mechanical precision, routing signals, maintaining network stability, filing the reports that would lubricate the next phase of whatever colossal plan was unfolding across the stars. My small role in something so vast I could not even pretend to grasp its full shape. Then, late in the night, when traffic had settled into a quiet murmur of maintenance pings and status updates, I received one final message that reduced everything else to background noise. It arrived over the most secure channel available to my station, wrapped in encryption that should have been beyond my ability to crack. Yet it unfolded on my main display as plain text, as if the codes were irrelevant and someone wanted to be absolutely sure I understood every word. Vextorian, your service has been exemplary. Your loyalty has been noted. Your survival has been arranged. But survival is not the same as safety. Remember what you have learned. Remember what you have seen. Remember that the line between salvation and damnation is thinner than you ever imagined. The Emperor protects, but his protection comes in many forms. Some of them are worse than death. There was no sender tag, no routing path, No trace of how it had bypassed every security layer of the Imperial communication network to reach me. But I knew who it was. The voice echoed in my memory, distant thunder through a Vox grill, inhuman yet carrying the absolute weight of command. The Space Marine, the angel of death who had stepped into my control room and shattered my understanding of my place in the galaxy. He had kept his word, my service had been noted, my loyalty recognized, my survival arranged. But the message made one thing brutally clear. Survival was not a reward. It was a task, a burden, a conscription into a kind of service most humans would never know and should never have to. I would live. I would continue my work. I would process the communications that orchestrated purges, eliminations, and the processing of populations on worlds I would never see. And I would carry the knowledge of what it all meant, what it cost to keep humanity alive in a universe that wanted to erase us. What sacrifices were imposed on people who never knew they were being sacrificed. The Space Marine had called it protection. The Emperor's protection, which comes in forms that are sometimes worse than death. I understood now. There are things in the galaxy so terrible that any fate is preferable to falling under their shadow. Corruption so subtle they can spread for centuries unseen. Enemies so patient they can afford to wait generations before striking. The only defense is unending vigilance, backed by absolute ruthlessness, the willingness to sacrifice worlds, populations, individuals whenever the arithmetic of survival demands it. I had been spared not because I deserved mercy, but because I had utility, because my narrow skills could feed the immense machine of war, surveillance, and extermination that keeps humanity poised one step away from annihilation. It was, by the standards of the Imperium, an honor, a privilege. Proof that my life had meaning beyond my own comfort. But sitting alone in that control room, surrounded by humming machinery and knowledge I could never share with another living soul, I found myself wondering if the Space Marine had been wrong about one thing. Maybe there were fates worse than falling to the enemies of mankind. Maybe there were forms of corruption more insidious than alien genes or warped machine spirits. Maybe the worst corruption of all was the gradual stripping away of everything that made life worth living, until all that remained was an existence dedicated entirely to survival at any cost. The communicator chimed softly. Another routine transmission slid across my screens. Coordinates for a new target system. Population estimates for worlds whose names meant nothing to me. Preliminary reports hinting at possible threats to Imperial security. I logged the data, set up the routing protocols, prepared the network to support yet another operation, yet another purge, yet another world where people would go to sleep believing they were safe and awaken to find that everything they knew had been erased. Because that was my work now, my offering to the Emperor, my small but necessary part in the continued survival of our species. The Emperor protects, the message had said, but his protection comes in many forms. Some of them are worse than death. Outside my window, the sun was setting over the ruins of Caith Prime, staining the sky a red that looked uncomfortably like blood. Tomorrow would bring more transmissions, more operations, more worlds to be cleansed in the name of mankind's future. And I would process them all with the same mechanical efficiency I'd always brought to my duties. Because the alternative was to admit that the galaxy was too horrifying to endure, that the choices required for survival were too terrible to contemplate, that the price of the Emperor's protection was more than any sane mind could accept. So I would keep my sanity by becoming something less than fully human, a component in the vast engine that grinds up worlds and lives and souls in service of a future that may never arrive. The Space Marine had been right about everything. My loyalty had been noted. My survival had been arranged. My service would continue for as long as the Imperium needed technicians to process the communications that make genocide possible. But as I sat there, watching the last light drain from a sky that would never look the same to me again, I realized he had given me one gift more precious and more terrible than survival. He had given me the truth, the real cost of the Emperor's protection, The price that ordinary people pay so that humanity can continue staggering forward through a universe that wants to consume it. Some of them are worse than death, the message had said. I keyed in the response codes for the latest batch of operational orders and prepared for another night of routing messages that would help coordinate the elimination of populations I would never meet on worlds I would never see. The Emperor protects, and his protection will continue, world by world, system by system, until every trace of corruption is burned away and only the pure and loyal remain, or until there is nothing left of humanity worth protecting. Either way, I will be at my post, processing the communications that make it all possible, carrying the knowledge that no one else can ever be allowed to share.